Scott Brown. Many of you on this series might have also seen our video with Mike Lynch, and you know, on that video I mentioned that when I decided to do this series, there were two people I really wanted to have as a part of this, and it was Scott Brown and Mike Lynch, especially because as a young band director I had the privilege of sitting in one of their clinics at GMEA, and as a young teacher who did not have a lot of knowledge about percussion, that really catapulted me into a lot more knowledge. And so I was really excited when they decided to be a part of this. Scott, thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely. I'm honored to be asked. Thank you.
So there's a lot of people, especially in the Southeast and in the state of Georgia, that knows the name Scott Brown. He's not a stranger to anybody, but we might have some directors from around the country or who are brand new directors who don't know your name. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about your background and sort of your career?
Yeah, I'm currently assistant band director at Dickerson Middle School in Marietta, Georgia, and I also am the percussion director at Walton High School, which is our feeder school. And I think this is year 13 maybe for that. So that's my primary gig, and I'm really fortunate to be involved in some other aspects of the percussion world. Me and Mike Lynch, who you mentioned, we actually do 2 summer camps, percussion camps during the summer. So if your kids are in the area, we would love to have them. It's usually the first week of June. It's called the North Georgia Percussion Camp and the Atlanta Percussion Symposium. We think it's one of the best things in the country. And I'm also the percussion coordinator for the concert division for the Music for All Summer Symposium. So if your kids might be interested in attending that in the future, that's for high school and middle school students. That's kicking back up this coming June. So those are kind of 2 of the big things that I'm involved with. And I'm on the education committee for the Percussive Arts Society. And there are a lot of very valuable resources through the Percussive Arts Society too, and it's not just for percussionists. If you're a band director and you want to join, go for it.
That's great, and everything that he talked about, I'll make sure I link down below. And for both Dickerson Middle School and Walton High School, if you don't recognize those names, a lot of terrific success in many different arenas. And so, you know, Scott's reputation speaks for itself, and a lot of the great things that he's a part of. And so, I'm really excited to hear what he has to say about all things tone production on timpani. Now, Scott, of course, every video in this series for percussion we've been talking about has been talking about tone, and I think it's very easy for an inexperienced director to forget to think about that percussion is just like every other instrument, and we have to give our percussionists just as much attention to tone as we do with any other instrument in our band room. And something that Mike said in his video was that, you know, bad tone on a single percussion instrument can take down your entire ensemble. And so, you know, I think there might be a lot of bad information out there, or we might be assuming about timpani that it's just another drum. And so what could you share with us a little bit that's going to separate timpani from a lot of the other things that we're teaching our percussionists?
I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, when you're talking about tone, it's either good or appropriate or it's not. And I think that applies, you know, any musician. You don't have to be a percussionist to say, wow, that didn't sound good, or that was an unpleasant sound. You know, so if it sounds harsh to you as a band director, then it sounds harsh to the audience. It's probably being played, you know, incorrectly. I think a lot of people kind of shy away from talking about percussion because they think, well, I don't know the techniques. But, you know, I think, you know, a lot of times I talk to my kids, I'm like, you know, did that sound harsh to you? And they're like, yes. I'm like, okay, so what do you need to do to change that? I may not always give them the answer. I may challenge them, okay, you know, how can I adjust that? For me, when it comes to volume, I talk with the kids in terms of 3 things: height, velocity, and mass. So the height being how high the implement's coming from, velocity being how fast you're sending it in, and the mass being the weight of the implement. And for most instruments, and we'll talk about timpani a little bit, for most instruments, it's not just the weight of the implement, but the weight of your hand and the weight of your forearm behind that kind of, you know, does the mass. When you're talking in terms of volume, it's got to be some sort of a combination of those 3. So if the sound's inappropriate, ask the kids, are you playing too high? Are you playing with too much velocity? Are you playing with too much mass? Or if it sounds puny, the other way around. You know, so, you know, just analyze sound like you would any other instrument in the band, and challenge the kids with how do you get the sound that we need. We need a warmer sound. We need a bigger sound. You know, we need a more articulate sound. Those types of things. And a lot of times the kids can kind of figure out a way to do that. In terms of the common things that I see in terms of, I guess, inappropriate sounds that you were talking about. You know, most of the time timpani is overplayed in terms of velocity. And in terms of the tension and the stroke, a lot of kids will downstroke into the head. And with timpani, you want more tone. Most of the time, you want more tone than articulation. So you want to kind of take the velocity out of the stroke as much as possible. And you definitely want to take any tension out of the stroke. And we'll get into grip a little bit later. But the more relaxed you are with the sound, or with the stroke, the more relaxed you're going to be with the sound. So tension and velocity are probably the two big things I notice when people are getting an inappropriate sound or a poor sound on timpani.
If we're working with students that are being exposed to timpani for the first time, maybe they're beginner percussionists, what could you share with us a little bit about what are some of the things that we need to teach them from the start that's going to get that characteristic sound?
Let me go back to the very start, because actually it's kind of funny. I'm in the percussion room at Dickerson, and the timpani were over on the other side of the room. So I had my 7th grade students move the timpani over here so it could kind of be in front of the TV and everything. And it occurred to me as they were moving the timpani that I have not talked to them about how to move timpani. So a lot of the little care things in terms of how to take care of equipment are huge in terms of the sound. So, you know, before you even get to playing, you have to talk to the kids about how to move the drums. For example, I guess this is probably the easiest way to show you. The pedal's right here in front of me. Of course, my kids do what most kids do. They grab it by the rim and start pushing it. And the way the rim works, if you push it off of its center, if you move it away from its spot where it is when it's tuned, then the head's not going to sound good. So step number 1 is when they move it, you have to grab by these struts on the side of the drums, near the pedal, lift the pedal, and then you push the drum. So that was kind of the first thing that I was like, okay, let's talk about this real quick. And this is, you know, I'm a percussionist, and it's kind of crazy how sometimes you just don't get to those things. When you see some of the students doing something incorrect, they're like, oh yeah, we haven't talked about that yet. So I had one of those moments today, getting set up to do a clinic on how to teach your students about timpani. So that's the key thing. Keeping everything clean. You know, as I'm looking at our drums right now, I need to get inside of here and kind of clear out some of the stuff that I see getting in between the rim and the head, because that's going to affect the sound. You can hear things rattling and bouncing around. When you move the drums, this is another important thing. You want to push the toe of the pedal all the way down for the exact reason I was talking about, because sometimes the head can move while you're doing that. So timpani are one of those things that you really have to, it's kind of a delicate instrument in terms of making sure that you're taking care of the head to get the right sound, because it is such a tonal thing. I've got, you know, our timpani covers have a big sign that says, this is not a table, you know, and that's for whatever reason, these things look like the absolute best tables in the world. And I've seen all kinds of stuff, you know, stacked on top of them, and that will affect the sound. So teaching the kids how to care for the instruments, just wiping off the heads, you know, keeping dust off of them, stuff like that. All that stuff will affect the sound, and, you know, definitely makes a difference, you know, in terms of what you're going to be able to get. In terms of actually playing the drums, it's very important to know with timpani, a couple of things. I don't know if you can see here, there's a line on the head. Are you able to see that?
Yep, we can.
So pretty much all of the percussion companies will have some sort of a line on the head. Most people that I see put the timpani heads on, they put the line kind of going across this direction. What the line on the head represents is, if you think back to calfskin timpani heads, where the calfskin is stretched out from the spine of the cow, and that kind of the corners of that, so like here and here in this area, that's where you're going to get the best sound out of the drum, because when they make the timpani heads, they kind of stretch them from the center. So you want to make sure that the line is angled so that one of your beating spots is kind of at the corner where that line would be, if that makes sense. The other thing that's important for, you know, kids to know, most of the time when you see kids play timpani, they like to go straight for the center of the drum. And that, again, is where the most tension is. That's where everything's being pulled out. So it's going to have, it's kind of a nodal point. If you think about like keyboard instruments, that's where the least amount of vibration is going to happen. Same thing with timpani. It's going to be a very thuddy sound. So you teach the kids to play about about 2 to 3 inches away from the rim, they're going to get a much better sound out of the drum, a much warmer sound. So just knowing where to play the drum is extremely important. And then of course we can talk about the grip. I'm sure you've heard there's French grip, which is kind of a thumb on top type of grip, and then you have German grip, which is your common snare drum type of grip. And I know there are people that are firm believers that it has to be French grip. I think once you get into high school, that's a little bit of an easier concept to get into. For the same reason I don't spend time teaching my kids to play traditional grip for snare drum, I don't really get into French grip with them, because I'm just trying to develop this stroke that they can use on keyboard instruments, they can use it on snare drum, they can use it if they're playing timbales, drum set, whatever they're doing. This is a pretty universal grip and stroke. And once they really start understanding how to use the rebound of the stick and how to use the natural rebound of whatever instrument they're playing, understanding how to relax and use the rebound is like one of the most key fundamental things about percussion. Once they get that and they understand how to use the rebound, then you can switch to these other grips. So I don't think, especially if you're not a percussionist, I don't think it's necessary to try to teach them French grip just because somebody said, well, that's the way, symphony orchestra players play timpani. Well, that's fantastic. This is a 6th grader or a 7th grader or whatever it happens to be. So for me personally, German grip, just keep it simple for the kids so they can really focus on one type of grip. And that's just, you have your fulcrum about if you break the stick up into thirds, about right here, a third of the way up the stick. Some people like to hold it a little bit further back, and sometimes I will have the kids to do that just to get more weight and mass in front of the hand. But for the most part, you can think about a third of the way up the stick being your fulcrum, and keep the other fingers relaxed around the stick. With most of the instruments, and I talk about this a lot for keyboard and snare drum, I want the kids to keep their hands relaxed, but I want that weight and mass of their hand and forearm to be a part of the sound, to give us a fuller sound. For timpani, a lot of times you don't really want that. You want the weight and the mass of the stick, the mallet that you're playing with, to kind of be that sole producer of the sound. And that's kind of, again, it varies depending on what you're playing, how big of a sound you need. But for the most part, with timpani, you just want to let the mallet itself be responsible for that sound, and try to keep the weight of your hand and forearm out of it. As far as stroke, and this is another very important thing for timpani, having a nice, relaxed, solid legato stroke is, a very key part of it. And you can practice that on a drum pad, with your students. Once you've got a nice, relaxed legato stroke where you send the mallet in, the head sends it back up to you. And all you have to do is send it down, let it bounce back up. That's going to get you a lot of your timpani technique that you want to use on the drums. You don't want to downstroke into the timpani because what it does is it causes a quick flex in the head, and it causes the pitch to bend a little bit. And that's not exactly a sound that you want out of the timpani. You want a nice tonal approach. So legato stroke is pretty much the primary way to go with that. And I guess one other thing to talk about in terms of the sound is, the sound can last a while. So you have to talk to the kids about muting. If there's a rest, just put your hand on the drum. It doesn't have to be anything super fancy. Some people talk about doing this. If a person's got dry fingers, it might squeak. So that's kind of up to you. But I just kind of tell my kids to put their fingers, on the head to mute it if that's something that we need to do. And sometimes you can get sympathetic vibration. So you might hear another drum resonating from that. I talk with my kids, sound is vibration. So if you want the sound to stop, then you stop the vibration. It's pretty simple in that regard. So
a lot of the videos, especially in the percussion series, talk about, even with percussionists, talking about note length from the get-go is really something that is critical, and there's no reason that we can't do that with our percussionists. We do it with our wind players, so why would we not do the same thing with percussionists? And and that goes for whether you're playing a timpani or whether you're playing on a mallet instrument or even an auxiliary instrument. I know you get around like I do and see a lot of different band programs, and you might see some bad habits or just things that are common timpani mistakes that students make. I'm thinking especially of maybe somebody who might be starting at a brand new school and might be teaching students who have been playing timpani for a couple of years, but they might just have a few bad habits. Is there anything you might be able to share there that we might want to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what I'm doing right now is one of the bad habits that I deal with my kids with. So I've got a timpani throne. It's a nice one, cushion, everything else. You can use a stool or whatever. But seeing kids that are sitting up on top of the timpani stool with their feet up, resting on there's a little circle at the bottom of this one, or if it's a stool, they rest their feet on the rungs of the stool. The purpose of the timpani stool is to give them something to kind of lean against. Because if you're playing more advanced literature, you might need your feet to change pitches on the pedal. Usually for beginners, a couple of things. Number one, it's not a necessity for them to do a lot of pedaling, so they don't really need a stool. And another thing is a lot of kids, beginner age kids, are not tall enough to need a stool. It's probably better for them to stand up behind the drums to play. So that's one of the things that I see a lot of. Is the stool, and it's just a matter of teaching your kids. It's not for you to sit on; it's for you to, kind of take your weight off a little bit so you can move your feet around. So you don't actually want to sit up on it and put your feet up on it, that type of thing. Another thing is, I guess, the playing areas, like we talked about. You want to set the drums up in a way so that the student can move around. If you're dealing with 4 drums. So the student can move around from drum to drum to drum without having to adjust their hand. They're in the correct beating spot. So if you can see, this drum, this drum, this drum, I'm good. And then I get to this one, I'm in the middle of the head. So for me personally, I would have to move this drum back a little bit to make sure as I go around, I'm in the right beating spot of the drum. And a lot of kids will just go and however the drums are set up, that's how they play. And then they're wondering why they're playing in the wrong beating spots. Well, it's because they didn't adjust the drums and put them in the right space. Another huge thing is a stand with a towel or a track table with a towel to put the sticks on to make sure that, if they're changing sticks at any point in time, I've just got one pair with me right now. But if they're changing sticks, they've got something they can put on that's going to be quiet. You look at the mallet, we've got this nice, soft, fluffy part at the top. And the kids will make sure that the tray is protected, even though it's not going to make a sound because this is nice and fluffy, but they leave that part uncovered. So this is the part that we need to make sure isn't making a sound. So they've got this covered. So I keep having to tell my kids, you don't have to worry about this. That's not going to make a sound. No matter what you do, you have to make sure this part of the table's covered. So I see that all the time. People putting sticks or mallets, even same thing with keyboards. They'll put a keyboard mallet down, it's making a sound on the stand, that's kind of detracting or whatever. So little things like that, I guess.
You're also speaking to somebody who also who has done what you mentioned, but also they feel like they're so brilliant because they put the black towel on the stand, but then they realize that they gave the percussionist one of the old flimsy stands and then suddenly all the mallets that are there just start going to the floor. So it's you got to be careful about which stand you give them to do that with too. I've learned the hard way.
Well, if you're using the winger stands and you have ever purchased any kind of an LP percussion instrument, the wrench that LP sends to tune their congas and timbales and all that type of stuff works to tighten your stands too. Because I go around constantly tightening all the stands in the percussion room because we use so many of them for mallets and sticks and that exact thing. And if they get loose and somebody knocks one over, one falls over during a performance, that's pretty rough. So
that's good to know. I'm glad people will be able to know that.
I guess the other big thing that you really have to think about with timpani, well, a couple other things. The theory aspect of it, make sure that your kids, I guess, understand the ranges of the drums. That's one thing we have to talk about so they know if they get a piece and they have to tune the drum for that piece of music, they know which drum to use. And they kind of have a general idea of where in the range of the drum that note's going to lie. So, for example, each drum has a practical range, and you can kind of work outside of that. The practical range of a fifth. And you know, with the bottom edge of that fifth, the lower part of the, you know, that range is going to have less punch to it because the head's not going to have the same amount of tension from that particular drum. So you want to aim for the middle to higher end of the range if possible when you're tuning. So that's another thing I have to keep in mind. But like the bottom pitch in general for these drums, this is the 32-inch C, F, B flat, and D. Some people tune this one to D, some people tune this one to E flat. But in general, the C, F, B flat, D is kind of your average. And then you can get a fifth higher than that out of each of the drums, so they overlap a little bit. And that gives, you know, gives you pretty good coverage. So having the kids understand that is important. Working with them on hearing intervals, you know, all the little songs, Here Comes the Bride, NBC, all that type of stuff, so they can hear their, you know, seconds and thirds and fourths and fifth. Those things will help them, you know, in terms of tuning if they know what the bottom pitch of the drum is, knowing how to tune up from that. That's extremely useful for them. So a little bit of ear training is important. And of course, the other thing to keep in mind, making sure they can read in bass clef. It's kind of a good thing because I've seen a lot of kids that, you know, they go up to the drum and they're sitting there going, trying to, you know, it doesn't sound right. And I'm like, you know, what did you tune that to? And they're like, well, it's an A. And I said, well, actually, it's a C. You know, this is bass clef. So, you know, helping them understand that is important. You know, so just in terms of knowing the pitches of the drums and kind of the range of the drums, and then how to read bass clef. I think those are probably key things that sometimes get glossed over a little bit with the kids, and they're just kind of playing the drums, but they don't know what pitch they're going for. One of the really good things you can do this. You know, I have a separate percussion class, but if they're in with the winds, this works perfectly. But having the kids, if they're going through, like when they're first learning keyboard percussion in 6th grade, as they go through, I'll have them say the note names and kind of touch the note. But having them sing the note name as they're touching or playing the note and matching that pitch from the very beginning when they're learning to read keyboards, you know, they may not know why they're singing. They may think it's a little bit silly at first, but having them do that, you know, as they're learning it, is having them say the note name out loud, but it's also kind of working on that matching pitch and ear training, which is extremely important. And another thing in terms of tuning, it's important to tell the kids, once you get your pitch, so say you have somebody play a pitch for you, get it from your phone, play it on a keyboard or whatever, get that pitch in your head, and then very lightly with your finger, just tap the head, move up until you hear that pitch come in. And if you don't get it, put the pedal back down and do it again. I've had people like at All-State Honor Band auditions, you've got a kid that's sitting there trying to tune, they play their reference pitch, and then they start doing, and then they look at you and they're like, is that right? And you're going, I have no idea anymore. I've heard so many pitches in between the reference pitch and all the ones you just played. So just a very simple glissando up until they hear the pitch, the reference pitch. And once they've got it, they're good. And if they don't get it, you just have them try it again. So those are key things, you know, in terms of timpani is the tuning aspect. And that's honestly, that's probably the hardest thing. And that's what most kids are the most unconfident about. And that's why a lot of kids are scared to play timpani. But again, if you start with the very beginning when they're learning to play keyboards, singing the note names, I think that takes away a lot of that fear.
That's great. And as with any concept that we teach our students, it all has to do with how we start it, when we start it, and if we do it from day one, then it's a lot less scary. It's a lot less scary, and it's going to give them a lot more success later on.
You know, posture, as with everything in percussion, is extremely important. Just making sure they have relaxed shoulders, relaxed hands, relaxed everything. My dad had a quote. My dad was a band director. He had a quote that he had learned from a percussion guy, you know, a long time ago, that percussion is the art of relaxation. And I've always kind of held on to that. I think it's a great quote. So that, you know, is probably one of the most important things. Just keep trying to get the kids to relax, because as soon, and the number one issue in pretty much all the percussion instruments is kids squeezing right here. As soon as you squeeze there, it tenses up these muscles and tendons going through here. And once you do that, you can't really use your wrist. And that's when people start doing this stuff. So keeping your fulcrum relaxed, keeping everything nice and relaxed around the stick, just keeping the students relaxed is probably one of the most important things to getting a good sound.
Scott, this has been really terrific and a lot of great information for all of us to take with our students as we are introducing timpani to them. If anybody has any follow-up questions about anything you've talked about here today, or maybe even something that goes beyond what you've talked about today, do you mind if they email you?
Not at all. I'd be happy to share anything with email, Facebook, you name it. Feel free to contact me with questions.
All right, I will link to all of Scott's contact information down below so you can reach out. Scott, thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, and it's an honor that you asked. I really appreciate it. Some people like to hold it a little bit further.